Hello everyone, me again, and today we're going to be looking at the fourth and final aspect of the Alexander II depth study, where we will focus in on whether Alexander could be viewed as a liberal ruler or whether he continued with his father's attitude of being authoritarian and dictatorial. This video will be relatively brief, as the depth study will be coming together quite cleanly now, and you will be able to make this judgment for yourself if you have been following the tasks set thus far. Before we start on this, we need to make it really clear what we mean when we use the phrase liberal. Liberal as a word has had its meaning somewhat diluted in recent years, but at its core, when we are talking about someone who is liberal, we are talking about someone who would prefer increased freedom, so more freedom. It would also refer to someone who wanted to avoid having too much control over their people and wanted to allow them to make their own decisions and their own choices. The opposite of liberal would be illiberal, and this would involve the oppression and persecution of people as well as absolute authority over the choices that they make. Now, Alexander II is a Tsar, or is a person really, of contradiction. On the one hand, he clearly wanted to take steps towards being a liberal ruler, with policies such as glasnost that permitted more freedom of the press, an increased degree of regional autonomy, and the liberalisation of universities too. However, despite all of these reforms, Alexander was still a Tsar, someone who, according to Russian Orthodoxy, was a man who was sent by God to rule all of Russia and everyone in it. He clearly had his liberal sides as well, most obviously evidenced by the severe repression we witnessed in the last video that was orchestrated against the Poles after the 1863 January uprising. Our job here is to try and identify the arguments for Alexander being a liberal ruler, as well as, on the other side, arguments that suggest he was an illiberal ruler as well. With this knowledge, we will be well positioned to deal with different interpretations on the topic and assess their convincingness, which, as you remember, is our ultimate goal here. Now, there are many historians, first and foremost, who would view Alexander II as being a fundamentally liberal man for his time. J.N. Westwood wrote in 2002 that with the possible exceptions of Khrushchev and Gorbachev, no Russian ruler brought so much relief to so many of his people as did Alexander II, autocratic and conservative though he was. Alexander is still held up across many states as the Tsar Liberator, and there is plenty of evidence that he deserved this title. Firstly, and arguably most significantly, Alexander gave the serfs of the Russian Empire their freedom in 1861, and eventually all of them in 1864. This gave untold millions legal rights, privileges, and freedoms for the first time in hundreds of years, and the impact of this should not be taken lightly. Alexander must have been liberal to some degree to allow so much social change to happen, especially when it went against his closest supporters, who were the nobility. After 1861, the nobility ceased to play a political role, and local management was given to the plural Zemstva. You'll remember that the Zemstva are a group of local governments that allow sort of local people in villages and towns to basically make their own choices. The Zemstva can be seen as another key reform that gave the newly freed peasants the representation that they deserved. While its power was limited and voting rights were restrictive, it was again a clearly liberal and vital step forward for Russia. Another example of Alexander's liberalness can be found in glasnost. Now, glasnost in Russian means openness, and as you recall, this was another key policy of Alexander's that showed his liberal attitude. In 1864, there was a legal reform that introduced the jury system, a system where people would come in and make decisions on trials, as well as creating a hierarchy of courts. Judges were better paid to avoid legal corruption, and the courts were made more transparent by allowing public attendance to trials. In 1865, edicts were issued easing rigid censorship regulations for a significant number of books, newspapers, and magazines. Another example of this is in education. Now, education was fairly liberalised under Alexander, although later on in his time as Tsar he would come to regret some of the changes he made to education. The spirit of these reforms, when first introduced in the 1860s, was clearly a liberal push to improve education in Russia. Alexander knew that an industrial revolution required education to succeed. This was to provide entrepreneurial people capable of leading and creating industrial enterprise, aiding Russia's industrial success and bringing it into a modern age. The other reforms of Alexander's reign created a need for education to be increased due to the intellectually demanding roles created, which needed educating Russians to fulfill them. Firstly, Alexander placed administration of primary education with the Zemstva, allowing local people to have direct authority and control over schools. He was also acutely aware of the lack of education in Russia, and so he introduced a new teaching code for secondary schools in 1865 that doubled the numbers attending within 3 years. In terms of universities, the number of students in university went from over 9,000 in the 1850s to well over 20,000 by 1880. These developments resulted in the creation of an educated class called the intelligentsia. Many subjects which had previously been banned for being too seditious, so against the state, such as philosophy, were allowed to be taught once again. Finally, it is of course worth mentioning that Alexander was in the process of organising a set of constitutional reforms before he died, that likely would have created a legislature or parliament and limited the powers of the Tsar. While this was never realised, as he was assassinated in 1881, the effort behind these reforms is notable, and it is clear that Alexander did want to make an improvement in terms of the way the Russian Empire was governed. However, he was assassinated, and his son, Alexander III, saw his liberal policies as one of the reasons why he was assassinated, as it encouraged opposition and made the Tsardom look weak. Now, despite his label as the Tsar Liberator, and our understanding that Alexander II did introduce a lot of pivotal and liberalising reforms, it should not be forgotten that he never wavered from being a traditional autocrat. It is clear that Alexander never had the intent to weaken Tsarist autocracy in Russia, and he was steadfast in his determination that Russia would continue to be run by the Romanov dynasty, as they had been sent by God to rule the country. A good example of this desire to maintain power can be seen in his governmental reforms, or should I say, lack of governmental reforms. Only one serious change to central government power occurred during his reign, when in 1861 the personal chancellery of the Imperial Majesty was replaced with a council of ministers. That's it. As the Russian Empire was so large and diverse, autocracy was seen as a practical, straightforward way to rule. Most of the Russian population was made up of illiterate peasants, and it was believed that democracy would be in the hands of those who did not have the ability to reason if people were allowed to vote. Like his forebearers, Alexander continued to believe that the Tsars, by law, were accountable only to God and not to their people. In the countryside, there was clear evidence of his continued policy of autocratic rule. The institutions of the Zemstva, which can be seen as a direct inclusion of democracy, were deliberately only created in areas considered to be part of what we consider Greater Russia. They were not allowed in Poland, the Baltic regions, or in the Caucasus, as these areas were seen as too unruly and rebellious to be trusted with any degree of local government. The voting rights of the Zemstva were very limited as well, with members elected by property, i.e. you had to own house or own land, and therefore including mostly landowners, urban people, and wealthier peasants. Some of the powers of the Zemstva would also be repealed over time. For example, by 1877, the Ministry of Education had entirely taken control of schooling from the Zemstva. More obvious examples of Alexander II being illiberal can also be seen in the way he continued to repress some national minorities. While his policies were fairly relaxed in provinces like Finland, the more rebellious parts of the Russian Empire continued to be severely repressed. In Poland after 1863, we saw last lesson that hundreds of Catholic churches were destroyed and placed with Orthodox ones, and in Ukraine the language was banned entirely from publication, as many Tsarist officials feared the nationalist ideas prevalent in both nations. Non-Orthodox religions such as Catholics, Protestants, Jews and Muslims were tolerated, but were actively encouraged to convert by the state. Finally, Alexander also routinely used the third section of the imperial chancellery, the predecessor to the Ochrana, to exile his opponents, in a practice commonly known as katorga. Tens of thousands of political and common criminals were sent eastwards into Siberia, walking their way to a life in exile. And when I say walking to Siberia, I mean walking to Siberia. This was routine for the Tsars until 1917, and while the number of people sent to Siberia was significantly less than under the Bolsheviks, it still represented a horrific punishment for those who had to leave their families behind forever. The picture you can see on screen is of a group of Polish nobles being exiled in 1863, and the name of this painting in Polish is Farewell Europe, as the exiles had reached a marker just east of the city of Vladimir, which marked the end of European Russia and the start of Asiatic Russia. As I said at the start, this one should be fairly straightforward, as we've already done a lot of this content by ourselves. And we come to our conclusion now. It is up to you to make your own mind up on whether Alexander II can be viewed as a ruler that wanted to increase freedoms, or a ruler that wanted to maintain his own power. But ultimately, I must remind you that our opinions aren't what's important here. The true purpose of all of this is to have the knowledge to make precise judgments on whether historians' views are convincing or not. I hope this has been useful. I strongly recommend listening over this and making notes on it. This will be here on the shared area for as long as I can. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at mitchellc@aesessex.co.uk and I'll happily answer them for you. This is the last of the videos, so you won't have to hear my voice for a while, except for live lessons, so rejoice and have a lovely day.